The next agenda item is to take evidence and hear an update from the Minister for Equalities and Older People. And I welcome to the meeting Christina McKelvey, Minister for Equalities and Older People, Jenny Kemp, Strategic Lead for Gender, LGBTI and Disability Policy in the Equality Inclusion Unit in the Directorate for Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights, and Nick Bland, Deputy Director in the Directorate for Equality, Inclusion and Human Rights in the Scottish Government.
Could you get any more useless in terms of job titles? I mean, make no mistake about it, this might just very well be three individuals that you can see on screen, but they kind of showcase a larger issue that is commonplace in the Scottish Parliament, especially when it comes to committees. Quite often I end up finding myself stuck listening to the absolute nonsense and waffle that a lot of these individuals come away with. But this was actually a video that I intended to make last week, but you know, personal matters gets in the way from time to time, so I never got round to it. But as it stands, I'm just going to kind of relay what I intended to talk about at the time, and it's really to focus on Christina McKelvey, the woman on the right hand side, as she kind of opens up her little book of to-dos that she's got planned, or the Scottish Government's got planned. She just kind of gives a wee bit of a reminder of things that are they've got planned going forward, all under the guise of achieving equality, of course, because that seems to be centre stage here in Rainbow Unicorn Land. You know, these non-entities are more or less, by and large, paid to represent their constituencies, you know, public servants and all that, but instead they seem to spend a good portion of their time, if not most of their time, playing the role of social engineers trying to achieve the fantasy of equality. But she rattles off several things in her list of to-dos, but there was three that stood out that I just thought I would be courteous enough to remind the viewers, wherever you are and whenever you decide to listen to this, what the Rainbow Unicorn Party are planning to do for 2022. So, with that said, let's get to it.
Very welcome. I refer members to papers 2 and 3 and invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thanks very much, Convener. It's a pleasure to be with your committee today. Delighted to be here. Convener, my focus is on ensuring that government continues to do all it can do to address inequalities, ensure that equality and human rights become part of the fabric of how we deliver for all people in Scotland.
Isn't that nice? Isn't that fan-dabby-dozy, you know? It's just remarkable. The absolute cringe from the Scottish Government. SNP, of course. I mean, Christina McKelvey's no stranger to cringe hot takes, let's just say that. I remember her very well before she went on a hiatus to battle cancer, which, of course, fair play to her, she's back on the mend, from what I could tell, but I still remember the days prior to her disappearance, you know, coming away with bullshit such as Scotland should not only be atoning for its racist past, but we should not be removing reparations from the table of discussions going forward. Yeah, just bullshit like that. Anyhow,
I'll crack on through these. So in other areas in my portfolio, we are tackling all forms of violence against women and girls through our Equally Safe strategy and the £39 million Delivering Equally Safe Fund, which supports 121 projects. Funding for now is at record levels, and we are committed to ensuring funding arrangements are fit for purpose. So I have also established an independent strategic review of funding. One of the issues that this sector has faced for many years is the precariousness of its funding, and there'll be members of this committee who will have experience of that. So an independent chair has been appointed, Leslie Irvin, and she's in place with an advisory group and has been appointed, which will meet for the first time in May. So I wanted to make sure that we had an independent review of this process, so that it allowed us to, you know, have a good critical friend to tell us what needed to be done. We're also listening to our older people. Last week I had very valuable discussions, as they always are, with our Older People Strategic Action Forum. We're investing over £2.2 million of funding in supporting older people's organisations and age equality projects. We are delivering an immediate priorities plan to tackle racism and address the unequal impacts of COVID-19 as identified by the expert reference group on COVID-19 and ethnicity. And this plan takes forward actions across government, including health, employment and education. The Government is clear about the need to act to end conversion practices, as we discussed at the recent debate, and can I congratulate the committee on that debate and the work that you did on the report. It's been incredibly insightful and helpful for us to move forward. So I'm pleased to tell the committee that our expert advisory group will meet for the first time on Thursday, and it will complete its work by summer, and I will meet with them on Thursday to support and develop that work too, and I can give you an update on that as soon as we have that too. Convener, a new human rights bill will be introduced in this parliamentary term, and we will consult on it this year. And later this year, we will also consult on our first equality and human rights mainstreaming strategy. And again, these are work in progress, and happy to update the committee as we go forward with that work too. And on Equality and Human Rights Fund, which totals £21 million over 3 years from 21 to 24, supports 48 organisations tackling inequality and advancing rights.
So she rattled off quite a few things there. Naturally, I don't really have any issue with additional funding, support and whatnot being talked about, discussed, or even in time implemented to help ease the lives of disabled people in Scotland or the elderly. Two groups of people that I do think, without a doubt, without question, should be prioritised. But when it comes to all these other groups that these people have intentionally deemed as marginalised, I take issue with that, especially with the levels of funding that she described to a certain extent there, that gets pumped into, say for example, the equally safe strategy, or just in general feministic policies across Scotland, especially while we're simultaneously told that we're on the cusp of a cost of living crisis. It screams out to me that they really should not be pissing away so much money on social justice escapades to achieve what they proclaim is equality of the future. And we all know by this point, surely, that when they talk about equality or lack thereof, they're actually talking about equity or lack thereof. But obviously, just for anybody that isn't familiar, I just thought I would briefly go over the equally safe strategy, because yet again, it's another example of the total divisive bullshit that the SNP, or the Scottish Government in general, shouldn't really pull back from, laying blame on other parties, considering these committees are made up of members of every single party within the Parliament. So the SNP might be the ones taking the policies forward in terms of their manifesto, etc., but every single party, to a certain extent, is involved in some capacity. Equally Safe, of course, came out several years ago, and I've made a few videos on it in the past, but it's really just the rhetoric that surrounds the actual document itself that I've always taken particular issue with, because yet again, you're met with sort of misleading labels such as a prevention strategy to eradicate violence against women and girls, but violence against women and girls isn't exactly what it says in the tin in this respect, or in this regard. I will say as well that while they're pumping additional funding into this to continue the project, alongside that we've also got the working group on misogyny and criminal justice that released the report, Helena Kennedy, of course, the misogyny report that's going to inevitably lead to the SNP accepting all the fucking recommendations that were put forth, thus leading to misogyny becoming a characteristic or a hate crime aggravator in the upcoming hate crime bill that still, as to my knowledge, been implemented as of yet in Scotland, but nonetheless that's coming. So we've got that as a backdrop alongside the seemingly reinvigorated phase 2 of the National Advisory Council of Women and Girls, the feminist circle jerk that Nicola Thinlips is totally not a part of, totally independent of government. So we've got that, we've got this, and we've also got Equally Safe. And you kind of get the idea when you come down to page 6, for example, on this Equally Safe strategy. It says here that Equally Safe is our country's strategy to take action in all forms of violence against women and girls. And by this, we mean the violent and abusive behaviour carried out predominantly by men, but not limited to men, so therefore you've already debunked your own argument. Nonetheless, directed at women and girls precisely because of their gender. Precisely because of their gender. Very clever. However, behaviour that stems from systemic, deep-rooted women's inequality, and which includes domestic abuse, rape, sexual assault, commercial sexual exploitation like prostitution, and the so-called honour-based violence like female genital mutilation and forced marriage. Whatever form it takes, violence against women and girls can have both an immediate and long-lasting impact on the women, children and young people directly involved. It is quite simply unacceptable for modern-day Scotland and does not reflect the country of equality we aspire to be. So, see, right off the bat, when they refer to equality, of course, you just come back up to the paragraph that I read at the beginning, when it refers to behaviour that stems from systemic, deep-rooted women's inequality. right? So naturally we're talking about lack of representation, lack of women CEOs, lack of women in parliament, power dynamics, because this is fundamentally what it's all about. In fact, an old document that I came across relating to this to some extent, all the way back in 2010, so this was even before Nicola Thinlips had graced our screens as the First Minister. This was Big Boy Salmond, if I'm not mistaken. What does gender have to do with violence against women? So this was before all their publications came into effect and whatnot. This was kind of the foundations being built. So working with COSLA, of course. And they produced their very limited in terms of information in comparison to the bullshit that you now get force-fed if you choose to look. But when you come down to the very bottom page, this is the second video in a row where somebody's distracted me. This time it's Scots Armour. Like, when you come all the way down to the bottom, it's page after page after page. But it goes on to say here, 2 seconds. While women are, of course, also violent, there is no evidence of similarly wide-scale and systematic atrocities perpetrated by women against men. Why? Are you ready for the bombshell? There are so many contributory factors within individuals, their cultures, the law and so on, which lead to violent behaviour and attitudes which condone it. Most men are not violent to women. Individuals always have a choice about how they behave towards others, but the underlying reason for women being more likely to be victims of men's violence than the reverse, more likely, so this isn't concrete fact, this is an assumption more or less, violence than the reverse is because women and men are not, in brackets, yet equal. It is the pecking order. It's about power. Oh, it's about power. What a fucking hot take that is. That is a bombshell. Fantastic work from the Scottish Government and calls all the way back in 2010. Violence against women occurs because currently, at present, women are not yet equal. It's a pecking order. Yeah, I'm sure that's what it's all about. When it happens in the reverse, when a woman's abusive to her male partner and whatnot, that's nothing to do with the power dynamics at play, because men obviously have the power. That's just attributed to whatever it may be. But when a man does it to a woman, that is by default because of the unequal power balances on display. So all the way back in 2010, they were peddling this fucking nonsense. Nonsense that quite easily could be debunked, refuted. If I can do it, I'm sure a so-called expert could do it. So why, quite frankly, there is never any pushback is beyond me. It just seems to be a political consensus across the Rainbow Unicorn Parliament. But again, this is on page 7 back on the Equally Safe strategy. It goes on to say here, kind of alluding to the point I just made, however, it is clear that much more needs to be done. We need to eliminate the systemic gender inequality that lies at the root of violence against women and girls. And we need to be bold in how we do that through prioritising a relentless focus on prevention. At the same time, we need to make the best use of resources and drive continuous improvement in ensuring that women and girls at risk of and experiencing violence and abuse receive joined-up effective mainstream and specialist service provision across Scotland. But this here. However, it is clear that much more needs to be done. We need to eliminate the systemic gender inequality. Again, we're talking about those power dynamics, power imbalances, etc., etc. So the feministic opportunism is rife. It is very clear to see. In order to apparently eradicate violence against women and girls, domestic abuse, rape, etc., etc., we first need to achieve gender equality. That thing they continuously whine and moan about. For example, the lack of female representation in Parliament. I can give you another example of that, actually. Fucking bang on example.
Which is a big gap, I think. But I think the thing that I would want to say, and it sort of piggybacks on what Davey was saying, which is that what we have a reputation now in the world, I know because I get asked to talk about it all the time, for having the world's gold standard domestic abuse law. And when people ask me what made that law special, I said it was about the fact that for 20 years now, we've known that violence against women and domestic abuse were causes and consequences of women's inequality. Unfortunately, it is only recently that we have started to do something with that analysis and started to realize that if we want, that a good indicator of our work on violence against women is, have we closed the pay gap? Are, women still disproportionately so much more likely to be poor? Are children so much more likely to be poor? All of are women 50% of our parliament? Not yet.
Not yet. You see, any opportunity to talk about disparities and so-called inequality, because the assumption on display here from feminists time after time after time, and it's littered in and around every single publication that comes out, and thus by extension any funding that then gets drummed up to support said publication. It's all geared towards shrinking disparities, the so-called pay gap, the debunked myth of the pay gap. Now obviously the pay gap debunking of old, they've managed to kind of counteract that with they've come back with their own argument, and that is to suggest that they acknowledge that it was sort of misleading, but in order to shrink the pay gaps now, we need to get women to do separate jobs. We need to get women to go into jobs that are predominantly or stereotypically male orientated, and we need to get males to kind of do the reverse, which I find kind of remarkable in and of itself, that they've got an issue with women in low paid jobs, but then they kind of want to kind of coerce or re-educate, I should say, men to do it instead. But nonetheless, the point is though that they want women to get better jobs, better paying jobs. They're not happy with how things currently are. But again, all of these things apparently will go a long way to eradicating violence against women and girls, because remember, violence against women and girls, whether that be in the case of sexual harassment, domestic abuse, or rape, or even murder, these things occur because of how things currently are. Meaning that because of inequality, lack of representation, and power dynamics, that is why these things occur. But when they happen in the opposite, in the reverse, gender role-wise, that can't be talked about. It's just feminist bullshit. But it's feminist bullshit that has been funded by our tax money, British taxpayers' money. Millions and millions of pounds being funded into this fucking nonsense. But they gloss over it by talking about eradicating abuse to girls, little girls and women. But it's the things that they attribute to it that are the issue here. So just to finish off on this, because obviously there's a plethora of pages that I could go through, but I've got another thing that I need to just touch upon before I end this video. But to give you a bit of an insight, if you aren't aware, some of the things that they talk about in this, some of their priorities, for example, they wish to see that Scottish society embraces equality and mutual respect and rejects all forms of violence against women and girls. Through this priority, they want to ensure that positive gender roles are promoted, people enjoy healthy, positive relationships, children and young people develop an understanding of safe, healthy and positive relationships, and individuals and communities recognise and challenge violent and abusive behaviour. Going on to say down here that their second priority, women and girls thrive as equal citizens, socially, culturally, economically and politically. Wow, imagine my shock.
I wanted to ask about, and your portfolio is very big, as I think as the convener said at the start. I wanted to ask about the racial equality framework, an issue that I know was of high priority in the last parliamentary session, and you would have appeared at committee as well.
See my fucking rude co-host, like that's been Clive, that's been Scott Sarma, like.
Well as the racial equality cross-party group, which I chaired in the last session, several times to discuss it. And I think you'll also be aware that in the last session and from stakeholders there's been some criticism of the framework in terms of making slow progress. So I was quite pleased to hear about the new immediate priorities plan that you outlined at the last session you were at. And I'm wondering if you could talk a wee bit about that, how that's progressing, what we hope to get from that, and also maybe a particular focus on issues around the employment gap for ethnic minorities and also occupational segregation. Thanks.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we established very, very quickly at the beginning of the pandemic was the disproportionate impact of COVID on our diverse communities in Scotland, and that's been a global issue, I think, but we recognised it very, very quickly, and we set up the expert reference group in COVID ethnicity, which did a huge amount of work and powered through many areas where inequality was always there, but COVID exposed it in all of its raw detail.
I will let this play on a bit. I mean, I have covered this ethnicity expert group, and the recommendations are some off anyway that were put forth. But it's just interesting to hear how she describes it, because it kind of gives you a bit of insight as to how the Scottish Government in general perceive the bullshit that these people conjured up, because again, it was rife with the opportunism that you will see time after time that's ever so prevalent in the feminist shit. You just replace feminism with race, and the same thing's applicable. Opportunism at its finest, because some of the recommendations that were put forth at the behest of this expert group had fuck all to do with COVID, nor any of the problems that COVID apparently exacerbated.
Which, you know, it gave us areas where we knew we needed to focus right in on. So the expert reference group produced a number of recommendations, some of them, you know, policy areas, some of them practical areas. So we've got two sort of a sets of recommendations there, and we're taking forward all of them.
Yeah, they took forward all of them. Standard procedure for the Scottish Government. They create these little fucking panels, these advisory groups and whatnot, like the Social Justice Commission, etc., to name one, as well as the National Advisory Council Women and Girls to be another. The advisory group that she mentioned there at the beginning, presuming I included it, regarding the conversion therapy. They hope to achieve or conclude their work by the summer, and that'll probably be around the time where they pass the law to make it illegal. And in this instance, the expert group. So a bunch of opportunistic wankers propose a bunch of recommendations, half of which are completely irrelevant to the initial creation of the group. And Chubcake McKelvey and Thin-Lipped Sturgeon and all the rest of these dickheads at the SNP, taxpayer expense of course, just accepted them in full. Aye, why the fuck not? Because it's all about equality here in Rainbow Unicorn Land. It's a fucking joke.
And accepted all of them as well. And one of the ways we looked at it was okay, here's the practical things that we need to do quite quickly, and we put some of that into place, you know, having, you know, culturally appropriate media and advertising on the vaccine, making sure that all of the information around about COVID and where you could get support was culturally appropriate, you know, funding the Ethnic Minority Resilience Network, and if you've not had a chance to meet with that group, it grows every day. Please, you know, have a look at meeting with them, you know, to fund, you know, culturally appropriate food, culturally appropriate, you know, interactions with people and support through COVID as well. So all of that practical stuff. There was some other stuff, some of it historical about, you know, our, you know, relationship with slavery and how we look at that and how we challenge that and how we change that, and there's work being done with our cultural colleagues around about some of that as well. But you know,
oh, is that right? Interesting that there's not much elaboration there. But how the fuck did a COVID group end up coming away with recommendations like that? Opportunism.
Really looking at the endemic, you know, ingrained discrimination that people face. So all of that came from the expert reference group, gave us a lot to think about on the work, and did, you know, expose some of the areas where we needed to focus a bit more. That's where the immediate priorities plan came from, and the immediate priorities plan, we published it quite recently. It was published in September 2021, so hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at that as well. But that looked at things right across, you know, the impact of COVID. It was, you know, looking at our race equality framework from 2016 to 2030. It covered across many portfolios: health, employment, education, housing, poverty, and other areas of government. And it took a really comprehensive and strategic review to inform our planned programme of systematic change. So the immediate priorities plan group is just being established. We have it will be chaired independently again from government by...
Oh yeah, independently from government. Pull the other one, you fucking obtuse wanker. Point is though, there she is, she's announcing that there's more plans in place to continue to press on ahead with the initial recommendations that were put in place. So, let's have a wee gander just for reminder's sake, eh? Because bear in mind, we can always take an expert panel very seriously when they try to imply that one of the reasons that there was disparities in regards to the worse effects of COVID being felt for BAMEs as opposed to what they classify as white Scottish, aka Scottish, they actually have the audacity, the temerity to insinuate that racism played a role. I shit you not. And then they go on to talk about vitamin D being hypothesized. You know, so some of the things that were put in place are suggested by people across the board, like that could have given rational explanations to the disparities. They were just lambasted as mere hypotheses. But they're bullshit in regards to occupational exposure or income disparities or a lack of understanding on Scotland's ethnic diversity or racism. They can be say it with a straight face, attributed to the disparities. Yeah, okay. So diabetes and cardiovascular disease, vitamin D deficiencies, they're just hypotheses, but a lack of understanding of Scotland's ethnic diversity. If only people were in tune and had a bit more understanding, then these disparities would not have occurred, you know. But they do elaborate, as I say, in regards to the racism aspect. I do remember going over it. Just hoping it's just down here a bit. Oh yeah. Ethnic minority communities will be more susceptible to critical complications if they contract COVID, not because ethnic and racial categories are themselves a causal factor, but because they map onto underlying social detriments, which generate these pre-existing health conditions. The lack of high-quality population-based data on ethnicity hampers understanding. Systemic issues are, by their nature, hard to recognise because they are rooted in our assumption in everyday practices. The Scottish Government approach to tackling systemic racism must include as a priority baseline audit of past and current initiatives and their effectiveness, and determine clearly defined measures to tackle systemic racism and the implementation of equality strategies. We need to better understand the barriers to implementing previous recommendations relating to the impact of racism and discrimination on access to service. There needs to be clear and demonstrable lines of accountability in relation to the ownership of actions and reporting of impact. But let's just get to the racism bit, alright? Oh yeah, there's it here. In addition to the important roles played by living conditions, the impact of racism as well as ethnicity needs to be considered as an additional cause of stress and disadvantage only experienced by people who are racialised. Again, we're playing into this critical race theory nonsense, but nonetheless, racism is a stressor in its own right because of persistent, unavoidable disempowerment, power dynamics again. Childhood exposure to racism, like other adverse childhood experiences, has lifelong effects. Expanded ACEs include experience of racial discrimination and are associated with poor outcomes in adulthood. Our understanding needs to rapidly increase and recognise that racism is itself a harmful exposure and also causes other harmful exposures. It is therefore important in Scotland to pay attention to the long-standing international evidence, in particular from the US, which is a completely different historical context to Scotland, but nonetheless, let's just copy and paste the bullshit that started off in America and apply it here, whereby racism is known to have a profound effect on health and illness, including at a psychological and epigenetic level. Minority communities will be more susceptible to critical complications, not because of ethnic and racial categories are themselves, but because they map... Oh wait, I've gone backwards. But nonetheless, so they're actually trying to imply that racism, quote-unquote racism, so those rife microaggressions that pester Graham Campbell when he's simply trying to shave in the mornings, you know, ducking and diving, dodging and weaving his way to work so he can preach to the Glasgow Council about racism all day fucking long and how he's Scottish because he's lived here longer than he initially would have lived in Jamaica had he been given the choice, you know, those types of things. They're rife, they're everywhere. And if you're lucky enough to have one of those 4K televisions, you'll see them everywhere. Just, I'm surprised footballers can play in the pitch. They're just fucking everywhere. Nonetheless, racism plays a significant factor. It's a significant contributor in the COVID disparities that were on display. But vitamin deficiencies and whatnot, nah. That's just mere waffle. The point is, though, that the Scottish Government accepted this shit. They accepted recommendations predicated on this fucking shit. Another one of the recommendations, amongst many, was given the new post-COVID-19 landscape and the highlighting of problems of institutional racism within the existing functions and systems of the state, there needs to be a focus on racism and anti-racism actions within the strategies and plans across the government, local authorities and public bodies. The Race Equality Action Plan is due to be renewed, and to ensure that a gap is not created as a result of the parliamentary elections next year, planning for the renewal should start as soon as possible with a clear focus that the actions in any revised plan will be explicitly anti-racist critical race theory, with clear actions, outputs and measurable outcomes. You know, and it goes on and on. They've got a plethora of fucking recommendations. The Scottish Government should explore the development of a workable measure of racism and discrimination and its impact on physical and mental health. This should be done in collaboration with leading international experts, quote unquote, and supported through a programme of rapid learning from the experiences internationally. Yeah, okay. Just riveting stuff, What else have we got? Change the curriculum for excellence. So just let's get this straight before I conclude here. So a group of dickheads and bames and cucks, traitors, whatever you will, came together on the back of disparities that emerged due to, some getting worse effects to COVID as opposed to others. This group were put together to apparently, put things in place to mitigate these issues for the BAMEs that were suffering disproportionately, allegedly, quote unquote. Despite the fact that I'm pretty sure there was never a report done in Scotland, they're basing it on English statistics. However, this group in turn decides to start chancing their arm and comes away with things such as the government should make a formal change to the school curriculum as advocated by Sir and Bemis. The government should amend the curriculum for excellence social studies benchmarks to include specific experiences and outcomes measures such as I understand Scotland's historical role in empire, colonialism and transatlantic slavery and how that history has manifested the present and also understand the diversity of Scottish society in the past. Oh yeah, the diversity of Scottish society in the past. All those white groups such as the Vikings, the Romans, etc. Yeah, but that somehow will translate into normalising the concept that Scotland's always been diverse in order to make the pretty little precious babes feel fucking welcome, yeah? Nonetheless, it then says there should also be the potential within the curriculum for a wider understanding of the global black history that bears no relevance to anything in Scotland. And then they say on the 17th recommendation that there should be an existing group co-chaired by Sir and the Glasgow City Council and community members to fund a scoping study for the establishment of a national museum dedicated to illuminating Scotland's role in empire, colonialism, slavery, migration and the history of Scotland's erasure of that history. Ethnic minority people in particular from African and Caribbean communities must be overrepresented within such work of our fucking history. They have to be overrepresented because it's not about setting things straight, getting the record straight and, promoting and teaching history as it actually happened. No, it's about promoting the anti-racist lens and thereby extension simultaneously the anti-racist ideology and history, revised of course. Further statutes have become a focus in the global moment and clarified for all they mean, what obfuscated reality they reflect and ask the questions of what they are saying and to whom. The government should be bold, creative and proactive and include young and older Afro-Caribbean people of African descent in Scotland in any decision making and any future decisions. So that's just a little example of look at this one as well. Ensuring Scots have a full understanding of our nation. Yeah, get fucked. Nation's history and in particular Scotland's role in slavery and colonialism, etc. And it goes on and on and on. But fucking hell, cautious of time and whatnot. So I'll finish up with what Chupcake McKelvey says to conclude. But you get the point. So recommendations just willy nilly suggested, accepted in full. And if people don't pay attention to the committees. If I didn't pay attention to the committees, if people don't pay attention to the publications on the Scottish Government's website, you'll be none the wiser of this shit. But it's happening. And all you get on the mainstream media day after day is Nicola Thinlips waddling about pretending that her face masks work, which is laughable considering she was pictured without one the other day, as we all know. Having her wee back and forths with the dickheads that make up the opposition parties. Independence this, independence that, Ukrainian this, Ukrainian that, cost of living this, cost of living that. Sustainability this, sustainability that. But behind the scenes, this cancerous shit is being funded and implemented and groups have been put in place to accelerate.
Two people who will take that forward. They come from a lived experience background and have a high profile in many of these areas. So again, that nothing about us without us. We need, again, our stakeholders and people with lived experience to inform the process of this so that we get it right and we make the changes. That will be called an interim governance group, and that will develop an anti-racist accountability and oversight view. It will deliver on all of our commitments, and as I say, it will be independent. It will also explore models for permanent external oversight. So although we currently have the EHRC and the SHRC as regulators when it comes to discrimination. We felt, it was important, and one of the recommendations that came from the ERG, the Expert Reference Group in COVID, was to have a external oversight governance body that takes account of the progress that's been made and holds government and public authorities to account as it does that.
Another scam. But again, that's a recommendation put forth by a group that was set up predicated on disparities that emerged due to COVID. A COVID expert group, quote unquote. The fuck are they doing making recommendations like that? But this is another scam. You'll quite often hear Nicola Thinlips talking about being held to account by the children with their climate change rhetoric. Or the Feminist Council, Phase 2, is supposedly going to hold the government to account if they decide not to go ahead with the recommendations that they've all accepted. And there she is there, reiterating similar phrases, where they're going to create this totally independent of government group that's going to hold the government to account, and ensure that progress has been made. It's just shit, because the government have no intention of not committing any progress, or committing to progress. But they get to use that group as an excuse. They have to continue moving forward, because if they don't, they'll be held to account by the group that they created. But if the group wasn't created, they would still make the progress to begin with. It's a fucking scam.
So the interim group will look at that, they'll develop that model, and they will come up with their recommendations and how we move that forward. And that responds directly to those challenges of this has been a bit slow, or we've not seen much progress here. There is lots of progress across many areas, but if our stakeholders are telling us they can't see it, then we need to take the responsibility for that. And that's why we felt the immediate priorities plan was a way to do that, to have that independent chairing of that group and to have that oversight body in place.
Fantastic. So, I wonder to myself though, anybody that actually participates in Scottish elections, did they vote for this? Anybody that vote for the SNP, did you vote for this? Or did you vote for independence? Did you vote for the false promises that you were given by Nicola Thinlips? Did you read the manifesto? Was this shit included in the manifesto? To my knowledge, it wasn't. They do this shit out with their remit. But interesting to note, and I'll finish on this, I'm referenced there to stakeholders. For some time I used to wonder to myself, just who are these people? But there's a quote in and around this video somewhere, but I can't remember where she makes reference to the fact that they get together with stakeholders and then they conjure up these policies. That's paraphrasing to a certain extent, but it's become relatively apparent that these stakeholders will be your engenders or your anti-racist organisations. So the Scottish Government team up with social justice groups, organisations, some of which are obviously funded by the government themselves. Together they conjured up policies, etc. And then they're implemented. That's just not fucking right. At all. It's not right. But that's Scotland for you. Peace.